My name is Courtney. I'm 29, and the moment I walked into my family's mansion in Milton, Georgia, my brother saw me from across the living room and smirked. "Oh, the useless one is back. When will you ever get promoted to manager like me?" My parents didn't even bother hiding their disgust. My younger sister Taylor rolled her eyes so hard I thought they were going to get stuck. I just smiled, put my bag down on the marble floor, and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Brandon kept laughing until he saw the first page. His face turned pale. The whole room went silent. Because right there in black and white was proof that I now own 88.4% of HaidiLao, the very company he always bragged about running. The same company my whole family once swore I would never be good enough to set foot in. Where are you watching from right now? Comment your city below, and like and subscribe if you've ever been looked down on by the people who were supposed to support you. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what happened next. 6 years ago, right after graduation, Dad called me into his study at the house in Milton, closed the heavy oak door, and gave me the gentlest rejection possible. He folded his hands on the desk and said, "We don't have the right role for you at Whitaker Properties right now, Courtney. No anger, no explanation, just a polite smile that signaled the conversation was over." I walked out knowing the door to the family company had slammed shut in my face. That afternoon, I met my two college friends, Marcus Delgado and Sarah Nguyen, at a coffee shop in Roswell. We had talked for years about starting something together, and I was done waiting for permission. The three of us scraped together $47,000, my entire savings, their credit cards, and a small loan from Sarah's uncle, and rented a 2-car garage behind a strip mall for $300 a month. That garage became the first office of HaidiLao Commercial Holdings. We worked 80 to 90 hours a week without complaining. I was cold calling brokers before sunrise, driving my 10-year-old Civic all over Atlanta to show empty retail spaces, and writing lease proposals at midnight on a folding table. We slept on an old sofa when we slept, at all showered at Planet Fitness, and lived on gas station coffee and instant noodles. For the first 6 months, we didn't pay ourselves a single dollar. Everything went into marketing, legal fees, and keeping the power from being shut off. Meanwhile, my older brother Brandon Whitaker, 33, started at Whitaker Properties the Monday after his graduation party. Dad created a manager title just for him, gave him a company car stipend, and let him lease a brand new BMW 540i that same week. Brandon posted photos from the dealership with the caption, "Officially an adult," and got 400 likes in an hour, mostly from Dad's golf club friends. My younger sister Taylor Whitaker, 25, received a paid summer internship at Whitaker Properties, which turned into a full-time position before the next semester even started. She drove Dad's old Mercedes to work and sent selfies from the corporate cafeteria nearly every day. I kept my head down and worked, while Brandon was having client lunches at Capitol Grill and posting stories from the VIP box at Truist Park. Marcus, Sarah, and I were measuring square footage in dark vacant spaces and begging landlords for 30 days of free rent just to close a deal. Our first real win came 10 months in a regional grocery chain needed 40,000 square feet fast. We found them a dark shell in Buford, negotiated the landlord down 60% on base rent for the first 2 years, and received our first commission check, $29,000 split 3 ways. I took my share and immediately opened my first brokerage account under an LLC called Roswell Retail Holdings. Year 2 was brutal. 2 deals collapsed at the last minute. The garage landlord threatened to evict us, and Marcus nearly quit. I convinced him to stay by showing him the pipeline, 12 letters of intent in negotiation. We worked 18-hour days for 3 straight months and closed 8 of them. Revenue passed $2 million that year, and we finally moved into a real office 1,200 square feet above a nail salon in Alpharetta. I still drove the same old Civic, still packed lunch, still slept on the couch when deals ran late. Brandon was promoted to director of leasing at Whitaker Properties. Dad threw a party at the golf club and rented a Lamborghini as a photo prop. Taylor posted videos of Brandon cutting cake under a banner that said, "Future of the Family Business." I watched exactly 3 seconds, closed Instagram, and went back to running numbers. By the end of year 3, HaidiLao was profitable every quarter. We had 20 employees, a real payroll system, and a line of credit from a community bank that finally believed in us. I poured every extra dollar into buying Whitaker Properties shares. The family company had gone partially public years earlier to fund a major expansion, and about 25% of its stock traded freely. I used 3 brokerage accounts and 2 new LLCs to buy small lots every week, always staying under the 5% threshold. No one at home noticed. To them, I was just doing some real estate thing and probably failing quietly. Mom once asked if I needed help paying rent. I told her work was fine and changed the subject. Marcus and Sarah became my real family. We celebrated our first 7-figure profit year with takeout pizza in the office at 2 in the morning. I raised a plastic cup of cheap champagne and said the next goal: own the company that rejected me. They laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. Brandon bought a condo in Buckhead with money from Dad. Taylor got an Audi Q5 for her birthday. Dad sent group texts bragging about record occupancy at Whitaker Properties and how proud he was of the kids who stayed with the company. I read the messages, deleted the thread, and wired another commission check into the brokerage accounts. 5 years after that garage, HaidiLao Commercial Holdings had 75,000 employees across its 40 regional offices and managed more than 20 million square feet throughout the Southeast. My net worth on paper exceeded $300 million, almost entirely tied up in the quiet, steady purchase of Whitaker Properties stock. And up to that point, not a single person in the Milton house knew anything. I took the fresh profits along with the newly approved line of credit and quietly turned all of it into ammunition. Whitaker Properties still had about 25% of its shares trading publicly from the old capital raise Dad did back when Brandon was in high school. I already owned a small portion from the early days, but now I had real money to move. Through 4 different LLCs and 3 brokerage accounts, I began sweeping up blocks whenever the price dipped after a bad quarter, or when a small fund needed liquidity. Every transaction stayed under the 5% reporting threshold, so no SEC filing ever carried my name. By the end of that fiscal year, my ownership in the family company had reached 10.8%, and no one in the Milton house had the slightest clue. Brandon blocked me on every platform after I commented congrats under one of his promotion posts, and he decided I was being sarcastic. From that day on, he never saw what I was building. Taylor kept posting stories from Whitaker Properties events, always with the same caption about carrying on the legacy. Mom occasionally forwarded me a few family photos with a note asking when I would settle into something stable. Dad simply stopped talking about work whenever I was around, as if my small company was just a hobby that would soon fade away. They weren't entirely wrong about the image I let them believe. I still showed up to family dinners in the same simple dresses as always, still drove a modest car, still dodged questions about money with vague lines like doing okay. The truth stayed locked behind NDAs and layers of LLCs. Inside HaidiLao, we were expanding very fast. We opened a second office in Charlotte, hired 20 new brokers, and started managing assets for institutional owners. Kayla Rivera, a brilliant analyst we poached from a competitor in Nashville, became my right hand in capital markets. She could read a financial statement faster than people read headlines and never asked me a single personal question. Patrick O'Connor, Whitaker Properties' longtime controller who had known Dad for 30 years, happened to be at an industry conference where I sat on a small panel about emerging retail corridors. He nodded politely from the 3rd row, but never connected the woman speaking on stage with the quiet daughter he remembered from Christmas parties. I preferred it that way. Every dividend from the Whitaker shares I owned went straight back into reinvestment. When a pension fund in Florida dumped a 2% block after the fund manager retired, I swept it up within 48 hours through a blind trust in Delaware. When a widow in Savannah needed cash after her husband passed away, her financial advisor called my broker and I paid a small premium to close quickly. 10.8 crept to 11.4, then 11.9. The spreadsheet on my office wall tracked every share like a war map. At home, everything stayed the same. Brandon got another promotion and a bigger office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Peachtree. Dad bragged about occupancy hitting 97% and how the company was finally ready for the next generation. Taylor moved into a brand new townhouse Dad helped her buy and started planning an engagement party everyone assumed he would fund the same way. I sent a gift card and skipped the party. HaidiLao reached $20 million in revenue the following year. We made the Incvine 5000 list as one of the fastest-growing private companies in the Southeast, but the article ran in a trade journal nobody in my family read. Marcus and Sarah took salaries north of $300,000 each and started talking about buying beach houses. I kept my own under $200 and funneled the difference into the plan. The gap between who they thought I was and who I had become widened every quarter. To them, HaidiLao was just a little shop I ran with two friends, something to keep me busy, until the day I came to my senses and asked Dad for a proper job. They had no idea the company they mocked was quietly swallowing their inheritance one share at a time. And I made sure it stayed that way. Last Christmas Eve. After the plates were cleared and the grandkids had gone to bed, Dad asked everyone to gather in the formal living room. The fire was crackling, the tree lights were twinkling, and he stood up with a glass of bourbon in his hand, like he was about to give the toast of the decade. He announced that he had decided to step back over the next 18 months, sell down his personal stake in Whitaker Properties, gradually and officially name Brandon as his successor. The room erupted in applause. Brandon stood hugged. Dad gave a 5-minute speech about vision and legacy and promised to take the company to the next level. Taylor filmed the whole thing for Instagram. Mom wiped tears. I just sat there sipping my wine and waiting for the right moment. When the house finally quieted around 11:30, I knocked on the study door. Dad looked surprised to see me but waved me in. I closed the door behind us, set a thin leather folder on his desk, and slid it toward him. Inside was a fully executed share purchase agreement drafted by my attorney Richard Hayes, offering to buy Dad's entire 31% block immediately at 22% above the 30-day average closing price, plus full assumption and payoff of every personal guarantee and private loan. He had outstanding totaling just over $4 million that no one else in the family knew about. The offer expired at midnight on December 31st. Dad stared at the first page for a long time. His hand trembled slightly when he turned to the signature block. I stayed quiet. He finally looked up, eyes glassy, and asked the only question that mattered. How did you know about the debt? I told him the truth. I had seen the lien filings and the second mortgages when I was doing due diligence on the public shares. He didn't ask how a little startup girl had access to that information. He just swallowed hard and reached for the Mont Blanc pen I had placed beside the document. We signed in silence. Richard had already arranged for a notary to wait in the kitchen. She witnessed both signatures, stamped the pages, and left without a word. Dad added his own handwritten non-disclosure clause at the bottom. He would not disclose the sale to anyone, including Mom and Brandon, for at least 18 months. He shook my hand like we were strangers closing a business deal, then poured himself another bourbon and stared into the fireplace until I left the room. 3 days later, the wire hit his personal account. By the end of January, every banknote in his name was paid in full. Title to the 31% transferred into a newly formed Delaware holding company that traced back through 6 layers of LLCs to me. The moment the transfer cleared, my total ownership of Whitaker Properties crossed 52%. Absolute control. I didn't waste a week. The board, still mostly Dad's old golf buddies, received an emergency meeting notice for February 10th. I walked in with Richard and a merger integration team of 8 people none of them recognized. Within 45 minutes, we passed resolutions to merge Whitaker Properties into HaidiLao Commercial Holdings as a wholly owned subsidiary effective immediately. The surviving entity would operate under the HaidiLao name branding and management structure. Stock certificates were reissued overnight. Every lease, every contract, every bank account was renotated. By Monday morning, the old Whitaker Properties letterhead was gone, the website redirected, and the signage crews were already peeling the old name off building lobbies across 3 states. Brandon found out when he arrived at headquarters that Monday, and his keycard didn't work. Security escorted him to the lobby where a new directory listed only HaidiLao Commercial Holdings. He called Dad in a panic. Dad, bound by the NDA and suddenly debt-free for the first time in 15 years, told him to figure it out with the new owners. Taylor blew up my phone with 37 missed calls and a string of texts that went from confusion to rage in under 10 minutes. I let them all go to voicemail. Marcus and Sarah met me in the boardroom that afternoon with champagne. Nobody felt like drinking yet. We ran the numbers one last time. Combined portfolio: 24 million square feet under management, 450 employees, annualized revenue north of 90 million, and 0 family members left with voting power. The company I had built from a garage now legally owned the company that once told me I didn't belong. I leaned back in the chair that used to be Dad's and looked out over the Atlanta skyline. For the first time in 6 years, I allowed myself a real smile. The takeover was complete quiet and 100% legal, and nobody saw it coming. 2 months later, on the night I walked into the Milton house for the first time since Christmas, the air felt completely different. Mom had invited everyone to a casual family catch-up dinner because Brandon kept complaining that nobody had seen me in a long time. I parked my new black GLS in the circular driveway, grabbed the slim aluminum case from the passenger seat, and rang the doorbell like a guest. Taylor opened the door in yoga pants and a Whitaker Properties hoodie, a company that no longer existed. She gave me a quick hug and whispered that Brandon had been bragging all week about closing the biggest lease in company history. I smiled and followed her into the great room where about 20 people were drinking and laughing. Brandon stood next to the fireplace, showing off in a navy blazer, telling the same story for the 3rd time about how he personally convinced a Fortune 500 tenant to take 2 full floors in the new Buckhead Tower. Dad raised his glass every time Brandon said the word legacy. Mom kept pouring champagne like it was New Year's Eve. He then kept showing off, talking about how hard he had worked to get promoted. Even though none of it was true, I had always given him the easiest assignments, yet he spoke as if he had struggled through all of it. Suddenly he turned toward me and said directly to my face, "Oh, the useless one is here too, huh?" The whole family burst out laughing. My mother, everyone only. My father didn't laugh. I stayed silent and waited until dessert was served and the kids were upstairs. Then I set the case on the coffee table, clicked it open, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The room gradually fell quiet when they realized I wasn't sitting down. I looked straight at Brandon and spoke for the first time that night. Whitaker Properties no longer exists. 8 weeks ago, it was merged into HaidiLao Commercial Holdings, the company I founded in a rented garage, with $47,000. Tonight, I own 88.4% of the combined entity. That means every single one of you except Marcus and Sarah now works for me. You could have heard a pin drop. Brandon laughed, first loud and sharp, the same laugh he used when he thought someone was making a tasteless joke. "Good one, Courtney. You almost got me for a second." He turned to the room looking for backup. Nobody laughed with him. I opened my MacBook, woke the screen, and turned it so the 75-inch TV mirrored the display. The HaidiLao dashboard filled the wall in crisp white and crimson. Courtney Whitaker, founder and chairman and chief executive officer, HaidiLao Commercial Holdings. 88.4% voting power. The stock ticker underneath showed today's closing price, and the new market cap, $2.1 billion. Brandon's face drained of color so fast I thought he might pass out. Taylor's mouth literally fell open. Mom dropped her champagne flute. It shattered across the hardwood floor and no one moved to clean it up. Brandon was the first to find his voice. "This is bullshit. You're showing us some fake website you paid a guy in India $20 to make." He stepped forward as if he were going to grab the laptop. Two security contractors in dark suits, men I hired that morning from the firm we use for our largest properties, stepped between us before he took a third step. One placed a calm hand on Brandon's chest and said, "Sir, the owner has asked that you remain calm." I kept my voice completely flat. "Brandon, you are terminated effective immediately. Your company email has been disabled, your key cards deactivated, and your corporate Amex canceled 30 minutes ago. The same goes for you, Taylor. Pack your personal belongings from your office tomorrow between 9 and noon. Security will supervise." Taylor screamed something incoherent and lunged at me. The second contractor caught her gently but firmly by the elbows and guided her back toward the sofa. Mom began sobbing uncontrollably, clinging to Dad's arm. Dad just stared at the screen like he was watching his own funeral. Brandon's voice cracked. "You can't do this. Dad, tell her she can't do this." Dad finally spoke barely above a whisper. "She already did, son." I closed the laptop and looked around the room one last time. This house is still titled in Mom and Dad's name, so I'm not throwing anyone out tonight. But the company you all spent your lives bragging about is now mine. Every lease you closed, every bonus you collected, every photo you posted with that old logo, it all happened under a company I control. Brandon made one last attempt, stepping around the contractors and reaching for my arm. Both men moved at once. One grabbed his wrist, the other his shoulder, and within seconds he was facing the front door. He yelled the whole way down the hall. Threats, curses, promises to sue, promises to ruin me. The contractors opened the door, escorted him across the threshold, and closed it behind him with a soft click. Taylor ran after him, screaming my name like a curse. Mom collapsed onto the sofa, still crying. Dad sank into his leather armchair and put his head in his hands. The remaining guests stood frozen, unsure whether to comfort them or leave quietly. I picked up my case, walked to the front door and paused, just long enough to say over my shoulder, "Thank you for dinner. I'll have the locks changed tomorrow as a courtesy. After that, please direct all communication through counsel." Then I walked out into the Georgia night, got into my car, and drove away, as the porch light flickered off behind me. The empire they said I would never be part of now belonged to me completely. And I had only just begun. 10 days later, the emergency shareholders meeting was called at the Alpharetta headquarters. Brandon had managed to convince 3 small outside investors, old college friends of Dad, who still held a combined 4%, to request the session claiming fraud and demanding an independent investigation into the merger. They filed the paperwork the same morning the trespass order went into effect at every company property. I walked into the boardroom at exactly 9 o'clock, wearing a charcoal suit and no expression. Kayla, Marcus, Sarah, and the rest of the new leadership team were already seated on my side of the long table. Richard had flown in the night before and sat to my right with a single legal pad. Brandon and Taylor arrived 5 minutes late with a lawyer none of us recognized, looking like they hadn't slept since the dinner. The 3 minority holders sat awkwardly between the 2 camps. Brandon started before anyone else could speak. He stood up and read from a prepared statement about breach of fiduciary duty, coercion, and possible criminal misconduct. He demanded the meeting be recorded, asked for an immediate vote to remove me as chairman, and requested the appointment of a special committee to restore proper governance. His voice shook only once. When he finished, the room stayed silent. I didn't stand. I simply raised one finger, and Kayla slid a thin stack of documents across the table to each director. The first page was the current cap table showing my 88.4% ownership in bold crimson. The second was the fully executed merger agreement stamped and notarized in February. The third was the certified shareholder registry reflecting the transfer of Dad's block. Everything was dated, signed, and filed with the Secretary of State months ago. I finally spoke. Every resolution you just proposed requires a majority vote. I hold 88.4%. The motion is dead before it begins. The lawyer Brandon hired tried to interrupt with questions about undue influence and the NDA. Richard answered in 10 calm seconds. The transaction was arm's length, fully disclosed to the board at the time, and the NDA expires in 16 months anyway. There was nothing left to investigate. One of the minority holders cleared his throat and asked if they could at least get a fairness opinion. I told him they were welcome to pay for one themselves, but it would not change voting control. He sat back down. Brandon's face turned red. He slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know how I had tricked Dad into selling. I reminded him the meeting was not a family therapy session and that Dad was welcome to attend if he wanted to answer questions himself. Dad was not in the building. The next item on my agenda was already prepared. Kayla distributed new organizational charts. Effective immediately, she was promoted to regional vice president for the entire former Whitaker portfolio, reporting directly to me. The room had known her for years as one of the sharpest operators in the company. Nobody objected. Brandon stared at the page like it was written in another language. Taylor started crying quietly. Brandon tried one last time, asking for severance and a non-disparagement clause. I told him both requests would be handled through HR like any other termination, and that the non-compete he signed 5 years ago was still in force. He would receive the standard package outlined in his original employment agreement, nothing more. The meeting lasted 27 minutes. Every motion Brandon put forward died for lack of second. When it was over, security appeared at the conference room door, same firm, different team, and informed Brandon and Taylor that their temporary visitor badges expired at the conclusion of the meeting. They were escorted to the elevator and out of the lobby without ceremony. The 3 minority holders left quietly, shaking my hand on the way out and muttering something about dividends staying strong. Kayla closed the door behind them, turned the lock, and the new leadership team spent the rest of the morning mapping the next 5 years. Brandon texted me once from the parking lot, a single line of profanity. I blocked the number. That was the last time either of them ever set foot in any HaidiLao property. 9 months later, the fallout had settled into something quiet and permanent. Brandon filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy in late August. The Porsche he once posed with on Instagram was repossessed in the middle of the night from the driveway of the Buckhead condo he could no longer afford. The repo company left the notice taped to the front door for the neighbors to see. His credit cards maxed out on bottles, watches, and private club memberships were closed one by one. The last time anyone saw him was in a navy blazer 2 sizes too big, applying for a sales job at a used car lot off I-85. Taylor lasted 6 weeks on unemployment before she took a serving position at a mid-tier steakhouse in Roswell. The same girl who once turned down job offers because they weren't executive track now carried trays of loaded baked potatoes and smiled through tips that barely covered rent. Her engagement fell apart quietly. The ring disappeared from her finger, and nobody asked why. Dad and Mom put the Milton house on the market in October. They accepted an offer 20% below, asking just to close before the holidays. The moving trucks came on a rainy Tuesday while I was in Nashville opening a new regional office. They downsized to a 2-bedroom apartment in Roswell with beige carpet and a view of the parking lot. Mom left me one voicemail the day before, closing just breathing, and a soft, "I'm sorry," before hanging up. I never called back. I changed every phone number associated with the company, removed their names from the emergency contact list, and had the gate code at my new house reprogrammed. When Taylor tried to show up unannounced one Sunday afternoon, the guard at the entrance turned her away before she reached the driveway. That was the last direct attempt any of them made. HaidiLao, meanwhile, had its best year ever. Revenue crossed $140 million, the stock split 2-for-1, and Forbes ran a cover story titled "The Quiet Billion-Dollar Takeover Nobody Saw Coming." Kayla ran the entire Southeast like a machine. Marcus and Sarah became 2 of the youngest executive vice presidents in commercial real estate history. We expanded into Texas and the Carolinas and never once looked back. I bought a new house on the Chattahoochee with floor-to-ceiling glass and a dock I rarely used. The only family photos on the walls were of me, Marcus, and Sarah the night we signed our first real lease in that garage. Everything else stayed in boxes in storage. Sometimes late at night I would open the old family group chat, still active, still silent since the dinner, and scroll to the top. Years of birthday wishes, vacation photos, and Dad bragging about Brandon's promotions. I never replied, never archived it, never deleted it. I just closed the app and went back to work. They had refused me a seat at their table when I asked politely, so I built my own table bigger and stronger, and then I bought the entire restaurant. They spent a decade telling me I didn't belong in the family business. I simply built a new one from nothing and swallowed the old one whole. That is the story. To anyone reading this far, never let someone else define your worth. The people who refuse to see your value today may one day work for the empire you build tomorrow. Stay focused, stay patient, and keep moving forward even when the door slams in your face. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is relentless success. Thank you for staying with me until the very last word. If this story made you feel anything, anger, pride, motivation, or even discomfort, please share your thoughts below. I read every single one.